The United Nations reform. The well-being of all is the responsibility of we all. Sovereignty must be determined by only equity. The nations of the world must join hands in order that life and living can be relatively easy. The indifference to misrule in any state makes all others vulnerable. But if we don't care because the distance seemed to be far, a journey only begins with a step, soon the faraway despots and tyrants on every one door may bang. If there is no external check and control, selected and elected representatives with dictatorial inclination in each state might or will find it easy to hijack the instrument of state through the formulation of obnoxious elitist policies that systematically give them absolute power. Nonetheless, globalization should only be a subtly systematic approach to promoting rational and equitable laws in all states and mandatory accountability of all statutorily constituted authorities to the people. The United Nations and equity. In order to be able to easily end social, political, and economic uncertainty in the world, we certainly need an organization that is pivoted on equity and justice. If the United Nations really want to remain the core organization that has influence on, and guides governments of nations through of our world, it must be equitably restructured. The plain fact is that it is irrational for the United Nations to talk about equity nor justice because of the way it's currently structured. There are nations who don't just want to listen to these doctrines, but who want the United Nations to physically practice them. Consequently, if the current 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council truly seek for world peace and if they are really sincere about the doctrine of equality, justice and fairness, they should support the idea of running the United Nations without preferential treatment for any member nation. Reformed United Nations organs. The United Nations Governing Council. The United Nations Assemblies of Nations. The United Nations Security Council. The United Nations Governing Council. The vice-deputy heads of governments from each member nation that form the United Nations shall constitute the United Nations Governing Council. Functions of Governing Council. To protect fundamental human rights. To make and pass binding resolution on all member nations. To help and support nations in improving economic and social conditions. To solve political problems in the world in a peaceful way. The United Nations Assemblies of Nations. In order for the United Nations to pass a resolution on any matter, the organization must send the resolution as a bill to all member country national assemblies for deliberation. Function of the Assemblies of Nations. To deliberate and make recommendations on the improvement of a proposed resolution that the United Nations Governing Council has sent to each member national assembly and pass the bill for adoption or rejection before returning the bill to the United Nations Governing Council. Privileged of regional assemblies. All resolution on basic life necessaries and on fundamental human rights are determined by majority decision. But a United Nations resolution on regional conflict and dispute between nations within the same region, i.e. Africa, can be blocked, if 65% of the national parliaments of nations in the region reject the resolution. But they must assume overall responsibility for diplomatic end to the crisis situation. They must make better recommendations, not mere suggestions, and explain how they will work to achieve their recommendations. If they fail and the crisis situation becomes serious, they must share the total cost of rebuilding the nation or nations. The United Nations Security Council. The Council shall consist high-ranked intelligence officers from each member nations of the United Nations. Functions of Security Council. To prevent violent dispute and war between nations at the pre-incipient stage. To make recommendations on conflict prevention and dispute settlement to the Governing Council. The United Nations income reform. The United Nations should be self-supporting. It must have a standard means of earning income to achieve the fundamental goals. The United Nations Currency Exchange Rate Commission. The United Nations Currency Exchange Rate Commission, an institution of finance, shall work with the central banks in all member nations. It shall be located at all ports of member nations to provide global financial services. Functions of the United Nations Currency Exchange Rate Commission. To determine the method for, or design the United Nations currency type. To set and regulate exchange rate of currencies. To prevent international financial crime by checking for corrupt practice with every point in any process of business and financial transaction. To confirm whether the goods which currency has been exchanged for hasn't changed through the support of the national custom of member nations. To concurrently audit international businesses with each level of transaction and issues a Thun Transaction Certificate for legal businesses. It also reports illegal transaction and financial impropriety to the legal authority. The United Nations currency and UN exchange rate. The United Nations currency might be called Thun. A Thun is equal in amount to all national currencies. It can only be revaluated when the gross export product of countries are compared. It is a currency that is used for everything that is foreign. For example, foreign travel, trade between individuals in different countries or trade between two or more countries and so on. Thun exchange rate is a system that fixed depreciation of a unit of currency for a unit of Thun. Thun exchange rate is based on the difference in gross export product, GEP, differentials between non-trading partners and the ratio of trade between trading partners. Gross export product, GEP, is the total income earned by a nation from export minus total amount spent on imported goods in a year. Type of the United Nations exchange rates or Thun exchange rate. Differential exchange rate. Trade level or 5 exchange rate. The differential exchange rate is the rate of currency exchange to a Thun that is between non-trading nations, which is determined by GEP differentials. The exchange rate between GEP of a billion and GEP of a trillion is set at 30% of a Thun. For example, if country Y has a GEP of 1 billion and country X has a GEP of 1 trillion, the three noughts count difference between a trillion and a billion is 0,000, which is equal to 30%. This is called three noughts count percentage or nought exchange rate. The exchange rate between GEP of a million and GEP of a billion is set at 30% of a Thun. The exchange rate difference between a country X with GEP of 1 trillion and country Y with GEP 100 million, or even 1 million Thun, will be 60% of 1 Thun. It means that Y, citizen, trader or government, will buy a unit of Thun at the rate of 1.6 to be able to travel to country X or trade with X. Exponential count or 1/0 differential exchange rate is used when two countries are both in a million, a billion or a trillion gross export product, GEP, range. For example, if one country has a GEP of 1 billion and the other has a GEP of 999 billion, to find the exchange rate between these countries, the gross export product, GEP, difference will be divided by 1/0 differential. Country Y has 1 billion Thun GEP and country X has a GEP of 999 billion. To calculate the exchange rate between these countries, the GEP of country Y, which is 1 billion, will be subtracted from the GEP of country X, which is 999 billion. Then the difference between their GEP will be divided by 1/0 less than the number of digit in the figure, which the lesser figure is subtracted subtracted from. Example: 999 billion minus 10 to the power of 9, divided by. To find the divisor: 9 significand 9 to the power of 1, 9 to the power of 2, 0 to the power of 3, 0 to the power of 4, 0 to the power of 5, 0 to the power of 6, 0 to the power of 7, 0 to the power of 8, 0 to the power of 9, 0 to the power of 10, 0 to the power of 11. To the power of 11 will be used as a divisor because it is a 1/0 differential. 999 billion 10 to the power of 9, divided by 10 to power of 11 equals 9.98. Then find the percentage of 9.98 in 1 thun. 9.98 divided by 100, times 1 thun equals 0.0998. It means country X will buy a thun at 1 thun to travel to Y and country Y will buy 1 thun at 1.0998 or 1.1 to travel to X. The differential exchange rate is also applicable to trading between country X and country Y unless country Y reaches self-sufficiency threshold of about 80% in local demand for agricultural products and the importation by X from Y is 5% in value when compared to imports from other countries by X at the end of the third quarter. Trade level or 5 exchange rate is the rate of currency exchange that is determined by the ratio of trade between country Y and country X, which must not be less than 5% in value. If country Y maintain minimum of 5% threshold of export to X and the ratio of the value of export from Y to X is consistently higher than export from X to Y for 3 quarters, there must be change in the exchange rate between country X and country Y at the start of the fourth quarter, which may further increase, if Y value of export to X surpasses the 5% threshold and the value of export from X to Y is below 5%. 5 or trade level exchange rate calculation. 5 or trade level exchange rate is determined by calculating the threshold pass, which is a minimum of 5%, might be more, devaluation of the currency of importing country X, if X export to a country Y is less than 5%, and 5% revaluation of the currency of a country Y that has reached 5% minimum threshold, might be more, of export to country X to a thun, and which determine a new trade level exchange rate between these two trading countries, Y and X. Threshold pass equals 5% threshold, or more, divided by 100, times the differential exchange rate of country X, with a higher GEP, where Y, with lower GEP, has surpasses the 5% threshold of export to. If the differential exchange rate between country X and country Y currencies is 0.6, then the threshold pass will be 5% of 0.6, which is 0.03. The trade level exchange rate of country Y that has reached the threshold pass will be 5 exchange rate equals threshold pass plus 1 thun. Trade level exchange rate equals 0.03 plus 1 equals 1.03. It means that X is going to buy a thun at 1.03, not 1 thun to trade with Y, while Y is going to buy a thun at 1.57, instead of 1.6 a thun, which is the primary differential exchange rate between country X and Y, which is based on the gross export product, GEP, difference, to trade with X for the next 4 quarters, even if Y falls below the 5% threshold of export to country X within a month after revaluation in the fourth quarter. In addition, if Y importation from X is higher and the export from Y to X is below 5%, the differential exchange rate will be used. If X, which has a higher GEP, export to Y surpasses the 5% threshold, The trade level exchange rate of country X will be calculated by using trade augmented exchange rate. Trade augmented exchange rate equals threshold pass plus the rate of country X currency to a Thun when compared to the GEP of country Y, where X has surpasses the 5% threshold of export to +1 Thun. Trade augmented exchange rate equals threshold pass plus differential rate +1 Thun. Trade augmented exchange rate equals 0.03 plus 0.6 plus 1 equals 1.63. It means that Y is going to buy a Thun at 1.63, not 1.6, which is the primary differential exchange rate between country X and Y, which is based on the gross export product, GEP, difference, to trade with X for the next 4 quarters, even if X falls below the 5% threshold of export to country Y in the first quarter of X revaluation. The United Nations income source. The Commission will take 7%, but might take only 4% from the nation that hosts the United Nations headquarters, from the profit that is made from selling a unit of Thun, and give 93% to the country with augmented currency or higher valued currency. If the exchange rate difference between X and Y is 0.6 increase for a unit of Thun, the Commission will pay X with higher value currency 93% of 0.6, which is 0.558, and the Commission will take 7% of 0.6, which is 0.042 on each unit of Thun. The income earned from Thun exchange will be used to run the United Nations and fund activities that promote and enhance mental and physical well-being of all people in the world.